Welcome to our Research to Policy webinar today. We'd like to thank you for joining us. We will be getting started promptly at 4, and it is 4 p.m. And I want to say thank you very much for joining us today. Well, here we go. Hello, and of course, welcome. My name is Althea Rome. Thank you for joining us for this 30-minute webinar in our Research to Policy Critical Conversations in Language Education series. This year's theme is Let's Be Real about literacy development for multilingual learners. We will focus on addressing real-world challenges and opportunities in supporting literacy development for multilingual learners. Through dynamic discussions with leading voices in the field, we will explore innovative strategies, research-centered approaches, and practical policy insights to enhance literacy outcomes for diverse multilingual learners. Today's webinar is Assessing Reading Difficulties for Multilingual Learners, and we will be speaking with Sarah Lillis and Shelley Spiegel-Coleman, and we are joined by our facilitator, Dr. Kia Johnson. We are recording this webinar, and we will post the recording on our website after the event. Before we begin, please mute your microphones to avoid interruptions. You can activate closed captioning by pressing the closed caption button at the bottom of your screen. This event is provided as a public service. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed belong solely to the guest speakers and do not necessarily represent the views of our organization. Our panel comprises esteemed experts who work at the intersection of research, policy, and practices in language education, language access, and equity. You can learn more about them on the webinars page. We will share the link in the chat. We do encourage you to ask questions in the Q&A box throughout the call. We will answer as many questions as possible at the end of our discussion. It is an excellent opportunity to tap into the wealth of knowledge we are fortunate to have here today. Also, please click the chat button at the bottom of your screen to share your thoughts and comments anytime. Try it out now by letting us know where you're listening from today. And with that, I will now pass the microphone to our facilitator.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you again for joining us. I am Dr. Kia Johnson here at Cal, and I'm really excited to facilitate this discussion today. The publication that is accompanying our discussion with our experts today is here on your screen, and this PDF of these slides will be shared out as well as the recording posted on our webinar site. So don't feel like you have to screenshot it now. You will have access to this later. But for the sake of time, I am going to go ahead and jump in with our first question. And I am going to ask you first, Shelley. So in most cases, screeners are administered to students in grades kindergarten through second grade. But what should districts consider when they determine the process for administering screeners with their multilingual learners to make sure they're not over-identifying or under-identifying students with reading difficulties?
Well, I just want to thank the Center for Applied Linguistics for inviting myself and Sarah Lillis to share with you some of the suggestions and advice that we glean from directors and teachers from the field about what is really important when you're screening multilingual learners for reading difficulties. Initially, I think one of the most important things is to think about the purpose. Why are you screening these young multilingual learners and other students in your school districts? There are a variety of purposes. A lot of districts use the screeners at the beginning of the school year, but the purpose for that is really to identify what do students know and what can they do to help the teachers inform instruction as the school year starts. But in California, we have adopted after a lengthy preview and review of many screeners on a committee, we've adopted 4 screeners, and there's a specific purpose for us that we think really needs a special attention, and that is for looking at students who may have reading difficulties. These are screeners, they're not diagnostic tools, and so once they've been administered, you need to double check with teachers to see if what we see is what's being observed in the classroom before we really go on to any further diagnosis of maybe some reading difficulties that students may have and need to be addressed. And so we want to make sure that these screeners being used are really able to identify a reading difficulty versus a lack of English language proficiency. And especially, again, for our multilingual learners who may be taking the assessment in English, this is a very important issue for those who are administering to really be able to be sensitive to the language proficiency that students have and to be able to distinguish proficiency from any issue of reading difficulties. The other piece that we think is really critical is to consider, when are you going to assess the students? In California, we really have made it it's a specific requirement that students need to have a specific level of English proficiency to ensure that the results are valid and reliable. The vendors who have created these screeners have said in their support materials what level of English proficiency students need, or they have a process for determining whether the students have enough English proficiency. But especially for kindergartners, we really think that the third or the fourth quarter of the year needs to be designated as the most appropriate time to do the screening and to be administered. And for new arrivals who come in the middle of the year or in the upper grades, again, a time needs to be determined as to how much time needs to elapse before administering the screener to the students. And then the other piece is, it's really important, if we're screening for certain abilities and certain skills, that students need to be instructed in those areas, and especially when it comes to foundational skills. We really think that a period of time for instruction, and then you look to see whether the students are able to demonstrate what they've learned. And so it's not something that you screen before you do the instruction. And the other piece is, these again are just screeners to give indications of possibilities. And so we suggest that these screeners not be used for any high stake purposes, for grade level retention, for grading, or for determining reclassification criteria for our youngest students. So again, the purpose and when to assess is really critical for us to really be able to get the most we can out of the screeners and to really help the classroom teachers and the schools see where they are with their young children. Next slide, please.
Awesome. So that's actually a really great segue, because you've touched on this a little bit, Shelley, but can you give us a little more insight on what questions and considerations our educators and administrators should think about regarding timing, format, delivery, even program contexts that should be addressed when they're implementing these early literacy screeners with multilingual learners?
Okay, Kia, that's great. So, for us, in California, 3 out of the 4 screeners that we adopted are available in English and Spanish. And I think it's really important that we look for screeners to be available in the languages that students speak, the language of their home, as well as the language of instruction. If that's not possible, at a minimum, we are suggesting that you talk to the vendors, the people who are producing these screeners, and ask them to provide translations of the directions in multiple languages. How important it is for students to understand what we're asking them to produce. Sometimes it's just the instructions that they can't get beyond. And so we're suggesting that, at a minimum, if vendors are selling to states and school districts that have students who speak multiple languages, that they provide the instructions in those multiple languages. And then the issue is, who will be administering the assessments, and do the teachers and support staff who might be administering them, do they have bilingual capabilities? Now, we're never going to have staff that speaks all the languages of our students, but we're really suggesting that you look to alternatives. Maybe there's a possibility of having the directions recorded in the languages that the students speak, and at least you use that. There may be the possibility that you have people in the community, there may be parents that you know who speak the multiple languages of the students, and really providing them with professional development so they can assist you in the administration and really be able to produce a bilingual ability of administering these tools would be really important. The other piece is that when you do look at instruments and they do come in multiple languages, one really would hope that we would look to see that the language that's being used in the additional language is really linguistically authentic to that language versus just a word-to-word translation. So the format and who's delivering and who's assessing is critical. There are a variety of ways of how it can be administered. Some of them are one-on-one, some of them are small groups, some of them are paper and pencil, and some of them actually are computer administered. Now you really need to take a look at that and see which of those you think fits best with the students that you're serving. We strongly suggest that all students who speak a language other than English be administered the screeners in English and their home language, because looking at the combination of the results of the two assessments really gives us a much broader profile of where our students are with their literacy skills. Some students may show us that they have high literacy skills in one area of literacy, and then that area in English may be very low. But understanding that they really do have those skills available is really important for us to know at the very beginning, and also when we're looking at students at the middle or the end of the school year in terms of suggesting that they may need additional support. And then the other piece is that those of us who have biliteracy programs in our schools and our districts, we would hope that the screeners really are available to be able to uplift the skills that students have and the abilities that students have in the multiple languages for which we have our biliteracy and dual immersion programs. So it would be really important in those situations to not just assess in English, especially for the kids in the lower grades who are in programs where the overwhelming amount of literacy instruction is done in the target language. Those situations really do need to have assessments in the language of instruction as well as the language of home. And so we hope that this is helpful when you're making decisions or you're looking at your implementation. And I am so thrilled to be able to turn this over to my partner, Sarah Lillis. She's the executive director of Teach Plus, an organization that does such wonderful, wonderful work with teachers to help them become advocates and also help them to become really professionals in their career. We have been so influenced by the work that they do. So Sarah, I'll hand it over to you, and thank you for the partnership.
Awesome. So Sarah, Shelley actually gave us a lot of great background on the considerations when we're thinking of selecting and administering these screeners. So in turning it over to you, I'd love if you could also cover the considerations about after we've selected and administered them, how the data should be used from these screeners. So how might an instructional team approach key questions regarding the data from these screeners to make sure that they're meeting the instructional needs of multilingual learners?
Thank you so much, Kia, and thank you, Shelley. I'm thrilled to be with you all here this afternoon. Yes, I have the distinct honor of partnering with incredible classroom teachers who I've been working in education policy for quite a while, and I have been challenged in ways that push us to really think about, like, how do we center the actual people when we're thinking about policy. So if a state's adopting a screener or a district's adopting a screener, our teachers have challenged us to think, okay, so then what does it actually mean for the adults in the system who are implementing it, the students and families who are being served by it? And so that really speaks to the point that Shelley started with, is our teachers are asking us to push instructional leads to really think about a comprehensive approach. Again, this is one tool in a whole toolkit that teachers, educators, schools should be using to best meet the needs of our multilingual learners. So that's the starting point, is really thinking about a comprehensive plan and approach for how to integrate these screeners into supporting our students. And in a way that, again, minimizes the risk of over-identifying and under-identifying. We really do want this to be useful for our educators to meet the literacy needs of our multilingual learners, but recognize that it needs to be supplemented with additional information about the student's literacy development and language proficiency before making any determinations about potential reading difficulties. Again, this is a screener, it's not a diagnostic. So a lot of our recommendations for instructional teams are addressing key questions and giving space to explore them as an instructional team. What are the supports, tools, and guidance that they're providing for educators to understand what information the screeners are giving them? What does this mean? And are there supports for those educators to understand that data as it relates to their English language proficiency assessment data, or classroom observations, or home language assessments, really making sure that the teachers in the classroom and the educators on site have the tools to see all these pieces together. And then what are the follow-up tools that are available to help those educators interpret the results and determine the next steps for supporting our multilingual learners. And again, to points that Shelley made already, what other tests might there be if they're not using a screener that's in their home language and in English? Are there other assessments that they can follow up with in their home language to help inform the instructional steps that they take after they do the screener? And how do they compare results for students assessed in both English and their home language? So again, it's really about thinking about what are the tools, supports, and guidance that teachers need alongside the screeners to really use them meaningfully. And recognizing that there might be limitations to what this to the screener. It's going to be critical for instructional leads to explore and discuss how the specific tool they are using will differentiate between reading difficulties and typical patterns of second language acquisition. Our hope is that incorporating a new tool will allow some really robust and meaningful conversations for instructional teams on a school site and on a district, that it is not just used blindly, right? So how do you create those spaces for learning? And then more broadly, what are the mechanisms to sort of review the indications of those screeners, right? So how are we assessing whether there is over or under identification of our multilingual learners with utilizing the screener? So what are the systems that the district and schools have put into place to be mindful and assess the over and under identification of English learners? But in addition to just understanding the results, if you go to the next slide, there's also how do we use them? Right. So our hope is that this is actually a tool for instructional planning, right? So it's not just understanding how this data relates to other data, but how are we actually creating mechanisms to coordinate the results with this other assessment data? And then identifying where there are needs for further assessment. So again, we're not over or under identifying students with reading difficulties. And then ultimately it's around ensuring that these plans for reading align with the language development goals of the school's program. I think Shelley talked about this, depending on what sort of program a student is in. If it's a dual language immersion program, I think there needs to be time spent in that school site or in that district in understanding that the instructional plans that emerge are aligned with the overall instructional plan, right? Recognizing that there are unique opportunities in whether it is a dual language program or not. So there's a lot to think about, but really the overarching idea is making sure that it is now integrating another tool into a comprehensive plan. It is not a standalone diagnostic assessment, right?
Absolutely. Like you said, it's a screener. It's informing what happens next. That it is not your diagnostic. Your diagnostics is everything that's happening with that data to determine where students' reading difficulties stem from, lie, and how you can help them move forward. So final piece here is families. So we've selected our screener, we are interpreting our data, but we have to communicate the results of this data or of these screeners to families. So what do educators and school leaders need to consider when communicating with families about the screeners, the results from these screeners, and particularly related to being parents of multilingual learners?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think it's so critical, and I think it's for us an important reflection of how are we creating the processes and steps for engagement with families before we even institute a new tool, right? I think
Absolutely.
making sure that that is central to the comprehensive plan that schools and districts are putting forward. So I think starting with whether ensuring that the screener itself actually provides tools for educators to communicate with parents in multiple languages, and more than that, in a way that is actually accessible and respectful of the languages of the family's languages and culture. So really, and if the screener doesn't, what can the district do to meet that gap, right? I think that essentially being really intentional about spending time and communicating with their students and families what the screener is. But I think more than that, um, it's again putting it into the broader process of making sure there is also time for the families to engage with the educators and be able to share their own understanding and information about their child's language background, their literacy experiences in their in their home language, their developmental history and their educational background, which is those are yet more data points for the educator to consider when looking at the screener, when looking at, and so I think making sure that there are these processes and spaces created by the school for families to not only understand what the educators are doing, but to help the educators understand their students' experiences. And then lastly, this is just sort of a finer point on the first one, is making sure that families and parents and students understand what the screener is and why it is, what it is different about reading difficulties and their child's language acquisition, right? Like I think there's both understanding the tool and understanding what the tool is trying to convey and share. So I think just prioritizing communication and engagement with family and students when integrating a screener into their instructional plans.
Awesome. So as expected, you have lots of great questions here in our Q&A. So with time, we'll see if we can get through maybe 2 or 3 of them. And then if your question does not get responded, it's not because it was not an excellent question. We've got like a ton of good questions here. What we will collect these questions and get them over to the speakers. And then as they can provide responses, I think our communications team will have a way to try to get those responses kind of pulled together for you with your questions. So I think the first question is a fairly simple question, and it's more of like just a note or disclaimer, but we do have a few people asking if they can see what these screeners are that you all have selected, or what do they look like. So if there is any information you can give them about the publication itself, or where they can learn more about what you all ended up identifying for your screeners, now is a great time to share that information with them.
So in the publication that we put out, that we gave a QR code to early in the webinar, there is a link to the webpage at our California Department of Education website that describes the 4 screeners and where you can, and the websites where you can get some additional information. It's very difficult if you're not from a school district or to get a sample of the screener to look at it, because the vendors, they are commercial people,
Mhm.
and so they're wanting to really engage people, and so you need to find a teacher or somebody from a school district to request the review of an independent review of each of the screeners. But the panel that our state empowered to do the review, they saw in depth the screeners page by page, and there was one question about whether the norming group was considered. And yes, the panel did look at who was in the norming group, and they did look to see whether multilingual learners were a part of it.
Awesome. I'm glad you got to that question, so I'll mark that one as well. So yes, they did pay attention to the norming group for those who wanted the answer to that question. Another great question that we had here is either in this publication or in future work, or do you have recommendations for considerations when you need screeners for students who are not K through second grade, when you have students who are coming in at an older age or in a higher grade level, and you need to be able to screen or assess their reading ability? Do you have considerations that either arose out of this work or plans for that work?
It was definitely a conversation that we had with our educators. It was an issue that they raised specifically. Currently, in the policy context in California, we're focused on K through 2. So I think it's something that, but that has emerged as a question that we don't have anything planned, but it's definitely a question that needs to be explored.
Awesome, thank you. And then another question we had here was, did you determine like set English proficiency levels that were required before one of these screeners could be used in English versus in a child's native language? And if so, what are those level recommendations that were recommended out of this? And is there a law or some policy in California to ensure that this is happening or to provide that exception? Even for students who aren't in dual language immersion programs?
So each of the vendors themselves, the publishers, determined what the level of proficiency was needed for their screener. But we, as organizations, we really recommend. In California, we have 3 different levels. They're labeled, and it's somewhat of an intermediate level proficiency. So that would be the level that at a minimum we would hope students would have before they're screened in their second language being English. And so that's our recommendation, yes.
Awesome. And then another question we had here was, how can the lessons learned from this early grades be applied to adolescents? We kind of mentioned that, but then also students who might have limited or prior schooling. Are there additional considerations either at early ages or at adolescent ages for SLIFE students in regard to early screeners?
So for SIFE students, I think we really have to look at, and Sarah was so good at listing some of the attributes that we need to consider besides just this one tool. And so with SIFE students, we have to see, have they had any formal education, right? What is their literacy level, and what has been their engagement with literacy prior to coming to our classrooms and to our schools? We don't have, as Sarah said, we were not, this was not part of the work that the state did to look at adolescents, but we have received many of the same questions that have asked here. It's a critical piece of work. It's something that we do need to pay attention to, but we're feeling a little sheepish that we don't have good advice for you. But with SIFE students, I think the profile of the students is really critical, is really, really, really critical.
Absolutely.
And I'll just say, we are hoping to learn a lot more from this process, right? So where we are, because I think it is having the sort of statewide adoption, it is nerve-wracking just for K through 2. And so I think what we're hoping is that as we're partnering with local districts and local leaders to be able to create mechanisms to be able to learn more as they are instituting these new screeners, that we can then apply for adolescent students or SLIFE students or those for whom the screener could be useful as well.
Absolutely. And then just one more question, just because a few people have asked it. You mentioned that the time to assess learners, about third or fourth quarter of kindergarten was recommended there, or at least at that, no earlier than that. Is that time period the same regardless of the program the students are in, whether they're an English learner or a multilingual learner or in a dual language program? Do you keep that timeline the same for all populations of students?
That would be our recommendation. And as the question includes the different settings, so it would really be helpful to, again, do it later in the year. Students that are in a 90-10 model and are learning all of their literacy in the first language, but also developing English language proficiency, it accommodates for them, A, to be assessed in their language of strength in the third or fourth quarter after they have been instructed, and then B, hopefully have attained some levels of English proficiency, at least to understand the instructions and to see what they can produce. So yes, it would be the same for either program type.
Awesome. Well, that is all the time we have for questions. So I'm going to pass it back over to Althea to wrap us up.
Well, thank you. This was very engaging. We'd like to send out a big thank you to our presenters. This was amazing. Audience was very engaged and had lots of questions, as you see. Thank you to our audience for being here. We hope you'll show up for the next one. Please watch your emails for a recording. Thank you, Kia, for being an amazing facilitator.
Absolutely,
and
anytime.
and we'll see you at the next one. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.